Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Marj, Britt, founder of Called by Love Institute and all of the things that came before it and after it. The telesummit of Living, Loving Legacy and the online courses, and now our worldwide monthly calls, and all of the incredible, amazing souls that have been willing to participate in this experiment in consciousness, this journey in consciousness and examining it, being curious, absolutely committed in that curiosity to being courageous and to entering into a field that potentially takes not only us individually, but potentially even the world into higher and deeper levels of knowing and living, healing, realizing what it means to live as the beloved in this lifetime, bridging this gap between heaven and earth. And so I've been fascinated in this time of the coronavirus and the pandemic that has absolutely said halt to the world, worldwide. And normally I say in an average, ordinary call, hello, world. And today, what we're experiencing is a world that is in shock, a world that is in the unknowing, a world that is in the experience of darkness in many ways, especially in our beloved United States. And it took me back to the first code that is in my book, Your Soul's Invisible Codes, all about unveiling your own sacred love story. And it's based on the codes, I call them codes. They're identified in the Bible in the first chapter of Genesis as the 7 days of creation. And my teacher in seminary said, this is the key to everything. And we don't understand it yet. From that moment in the mid-1980s until now, that imprint of those words has been a compelling factor in my life. My book is about it. And it's about glimpses into what that's meant. What I believe is we're in another glimpse. We're moving into a cosmic shift. We're moving into new revelations that we've never before really examined and looked at in our lifetime. And so the title of our call today, the theme of our call today is how does the void, the light, and the darkness intertwine, interweave, and reveal our next level of cosmic good. Ken Wilber, that I admire so much, always spelled cosmic with a K, recognizing another level of knowing, another level of consciousness. I spelled it with a C in the reminder email because I have an inner awareness, and I'll spell that with a capital A, an awareness that we need to bring together, we need to bridge the gap between capital A awareness and small a awareness. And so I used the quote from the Bible that says something, and I'm paraphrasing it, in the beginning there was darkness and void on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. What I've come to know in my own search and deep dives and teaching and yearning and learning is that water is always a symbol for the unconscious, for new revelations, if we are willing. And so I've been willing for most of the years of my life in different ways. And in that yearning, I almost always have gone into asking, sometimes at very concrete levels, sometimes at subtle levels, sometimes at causal levels. And today's one of those days I went into that yearning and asking, and the face, the name that kept dropping in was the name of someone I've known for many, many years, since probably, I'm guessing, he'll have to tell me if he remembers the exact dates, when we first met, which was, I'm guessing, in the early or mid-1990s. My beautiful spiritual friend of many years, Jeff Carreira. And welcome to the call, Jeff. I am so happy, so elated, so delighted that you said yes to being on this call today.
Wonderful. Hi, Marj.
Everyone.
Yes, hello, everyone, and hello, Marj. Thank you so much for thinking of me and inviting me. And yes, I think it was mid-1990s, maybe even late 1990s. But yes, quite a long time ago that we met.
Yeah. And, we have touched in with each other since then. We've seen each other, I think, live in person twice in our lives, once at Unity in Tustin and once at Unity Village. And it's fascinating that moment at Unity of Tustin, I think I'm probably remembering correctly, it could have been Andrew Cohen, but I think it was you, that I asked about Irina Tweedy, who was the spiritual teacher of one of my significant spiritual teachers, Llewellyn Von Lee. And I think it was you that told me that she had been one of the first people you interviewed for What is Enlightenment magazine.
I'm sure that would have been Andrew who told you that, but it was true. I do remember that was true, that she was one of the first interviews for the magazine.
Incredible. This is so, because Daughter of Fire is a book that I read cover to cover, and it's a thick book, highlighted on every single page. That is that fire, that passion. It's a living flame of love. And what I see, Jeff, is that that's been ignited in both your life and my life for many, many years. It is leading us, it is guiding us, and it took us to that moment at Unity Village when you and I together went to the grocery store. And at the grocery store, Michael Ward went with us, who is, one of my beloved friends and has been so important and dear in my life, and sort of one of the people that I've hung out with and had dialogues with about all of the things I didn't necessarily understand or know. I didn't have to be a spiritual teacher with him. I could just hang out and explore. And so today we'll kind of do a conversation like hang out and explore.
Fantastic.
And talk about how it's worked for you, and maybe I'll add in some things about how it's worked for me, but how we have to, at moments in time, act, because sometimes the universe opens up the space for us in ways we didn't expect. And that happened for you at Unity Village, because all of a sudden, and you told me it was the first time you ever stepped in to fill Andrew's role. Andrew couldn't be there for some reason. He was ill or could arrive late or something. And you were there, and you stepped in. How
That's
did
right.
that shape you?
Well, prior to that, I had taught. We had a fairly large global community, and I had taught within that community. But I had never done something public. So that would have been the first public event. And, of course, I did essentially a one-day retreat. And,
yes.
It shaped me because I don't remember being really nervous. I've always been fairly confident. Speaking with groups of people, I was a school teacher before all this spiritual life occurred. So I'm sure I was nervous, but I wasn't incredibly nervous. Like I said, I had been working within our community for some time. But I guess it really shaped me because during that day, as I was sharing with all of you that were there, the things that matter most to me, I just became completely unhinged, and in a very positive sense. I felt very free. I felt very at home, very at ease, and I could tell by the response that I was getting back from everyone who was there that what I was sharing and the way I was sharing it was definitely landing. And so I think that day, it went so well that that was probably the day that cemented my future, being dedicated to sharing what I love the most.
That just so deeply touches my heart to hear you say that, because we had no idea, neither you nor me, that was going to happen. And yet, as I watched it unfold and as I watched you teach, it was like magic. There was an immense power that simply filled the room. And you were becoming a conduit, a conductor of that. And yet you weren't using notes. You were totally speaking from your soul, your heart. It was integrated with a beautiful intellect, which I've always admired, your amazing philosopher's mind. But it wasn't your philosopher's mind that was speaking. It was something that was so beyond that. And there it bridged into the heart in such a profound way. And we, as Andrew used to bring people that were part of his community with him when he would speak, as he did when he came to Unity of Tustin. And you were there, and we met there at Unity of Tustin for the first time. But I had also brought a whole contingent of people from Unity of Tustin to Unity Village. So there were, 10 or 20 of us probably from Unity Village. And other people were invited because I think it was a World Day of Prayer. I can't remember for sure.
I think you're right.
Yeah, and so other people from Unity Worldwide were invited, and they filled that room in the chapel where Charles and Myrtle Fillmore used to teach. But the people that I knew, absolutely knew, would resonate with every word you would say, was this group from Unity of Tustin that had been part of this developing of a campus of consciousness and taking the deep dives, and they were yearning for more. And you were clearly the next step, the next piece. And it was fascinating that it ended up being you and not Andrew that did that.
Well, at least on that first day, it was me, and then then of course Andrew arrived. But yes, and it as I said, it was a blessing that it worked out that way. It certainly was a very important moment in my life, and really did set. I think it cemented a trajectory that I've been living ever since.
That is so beautiful. So what I'd like to do today is sort of keep it open and stay in the flow, but kind of be aware of where we could go with it. And one of the things I'd like us to do is to explore how spiritual journey unfolds in our lives. And by the way, I do want you to talk about the meditation experience that you're offering online. That's for for an extended period of time.
Sure.
And it's starting on Saturday. So at the end, more toward the end of the call, I want you to do that. But first,
sounds good.
Let's talk about how it began in your life, because often we don't recognize that this is going to be our life path or the living flame of love living as us. I mean, that's not something that a language we would even know in our childhood. So tell us a little bit about how all of this emerged for you.
Well, for me, from a young age, I had spiritual interest. So I was raised Portuguese. My heritage is Portuguese, so my religious background was Catholic. My grandparents were all born in the Azores Islands, and when I was fairly small, I wanted to be a priest, and I was always interested in spiritual things, and as I got older, I no longer wanted to join the priesthood, but I was always feeling like I didn't completely understand life, like what in terms of the life that was described to me as the life that should be satisfying didn't seem like it was going to be satisfying, and I was always wanting to know what life was about. So it was just always a part of my life, is constantly seeking and inquiring. And, eventually I became a self-proclaimed atheist because I decided that physics and science had the answers to the meaning of life. And I studied physics as an undergraduate and became an engineer, and kind of ran up against the wall there and recognized that actually science doesn't have all the answers. And then I got into cognitive psychology and meditation, and slowly started to get interested in alternative spiritual teachers, and eventually I met a teacher, Andrew Cohen, as you mentioned, and I had a very powerful experience upon meeting him. And within about a year, and at that time I had left engineering, but I was the director of a small school, and I was married, and I owned a house. And after about a year of after having met this teacher in this community, I left my career and my marriage at the time, and I moved into a spiritual community where I lived for the next 20 years. So when you and I met for the first time, I'd probably been in that community for about somewhere between 5 and 8 years, and I would be there for another 15 to 12 years, depending on when we met. But that was kind of how it unfolded for me in terms of the. Yeah, go ahead.
So it's very interesting because you had a graduate degree in education. I read that in your bio.
That is true.
And you had been a school teacher as well as a school administrator. So you had pretty much, a human mind had set some pretty significant goals in your life. I'm mentioning these things because I know one of the people that's excited about hearing what you say is in her 20s, and she's trying to figure out her next graduate degree. And often there is something beyond that. Even when we do these kind of lofty kinds of human goals, that's something that is beyond takes us into ways we never expected.
Absolutely, if we let it, of course. But yes, in my case, it feels like there was, I don't know how to describe it. It becomes your destiny if you allow it to shape your life. But it shows up as a possibility. And
yes.
And so it shows up as an opening, and for reasons I will probably never fully understand, at certain key moments when push came to shove, I trusted that possibility. I trusted the call that I was hearing more than I trusted my mind and its ideas about what I should do. And those moments were always key moments that, propelled me along on the path that eventually became my life.
That's so beautiful. That moment of saying yes and acting on the yes that foregrounds as things that your human mind accomplished and achieved began to background.
Exactly.
In my book, there's a chapter, Mountaintops of Another Kind. And I think that's exactly what we're talking about. Doesn't mean there won't be other mountains to climb.
Yes.
With all of their challenges and all of their elements of joy and sorrow. So go ahead and let's go into a topic I just briefly asked you about before when we were in the green room. But this whole topic of how it can sometimes work, and this comes from something I read from a pre-publication copy of a manuscript that I got as a gift from Richard Rohr. But this idea that sometimes trauma is part of a pattern of the pattern that occurs in a process that is highly spiritual, and I'm quoting from one of or some of the ideas in one of the chapters in Richard Rohr's book that's not going to be published until next year, a chapter called Trauma, Liminal Space, and Beloved Community. And one of the things that the writers say in that particular chapter is that living in a beloved community creates opportunity for very, very powerful personal and communal transformation. That's very interesting. Not just personal, but also communal. And that committed community living summons it, and it focuses powers greater than the sum of the individual participants in the community. Mm-hmm. That you couldn't have individually done what you did without this collective. And this is so fascinating because it actually becomes part of both your life and my life as we go through our own experience of emergence. And that intentional communal life is created in a liminal space, and it's higher and deeper and broader. It has a breadth as well as a height and a depth. And that's not necessarily available in one-on-one relationships where there's power over hierarchies. And that the beloved community somehow has an ability to invite us into really deep, transformative kinds of conversations and experiences. And we end up being on the threshold between who we are and who we can become. And then there's a sentence in the material that I found in this particular paragraph that says, in our experience, this liminal space will often, if not always, be accompanied by trauma. I've never seen that written anywhere before. And it was like it stopped me in my tracks, because I see that as something that happened in your life. I see it as something that happened in my life, in the experience after I left Unity of Tustin. And what it says, it talks about, is that a willingness to face trauma that carried by others as well as our own. The trauma is part of what is necessary to realize the transformative promise of beloved community. And I mean, I'm still sort of trying to digest what that means. So tell me what happened for you and what this might mean.
Well, I mean, I guess the thing that strikes me initially is the human species is enormously traumatized anyway. So before we even get to a community of beloveds or a spiritual community, I mean, we don't have to look very far into the world to realize that there's an enormous amount of trauma, that people have been hurt and wounded in all kinds of ways. And, you alluded to it when the call started. So much of what's happening right now in terms of the social justice movement and also in terms of the pandemic are both revealing trauma that has been there, and also inducing more trauma. So from one point of view, it makes sense to me that if you gather together in a spiritual community, you're not going to be immune from trauma. And I think sometimes it's possible in a spiritual community to mistakenly assume that you will be immune from trauma, that somehow the higher ideals that have brought you together will shield you from trauma. But of course, the trauma lives inside of all of us, and so a part of any spiritual process requires a certain amount of attention placed on healing and facing and moving through trauma in some of the ways that you were just saying. So, I mean, at least at the broadest level, that makes sense to me. Now, when we start to talk about spiritual communities, I mean, there's many different kinds of spiritual communities. And I think depending on the focus of those communities and the structure, they can be better or less well equipped to deal with trauma. And in fact, sometimes the community itself can be trauma-inducing. And that certainly has been the case many, many times. For those of us who've paid attention to these things, we're aware that a lot of harm can happen in spiritual communities. And I guess one of the reasons why that would be the case is because, generally speaking, in spiritual communities, there's an enormous amount of devotion and surrender and willingness that goes along with it, which does make it makes us vulnerable, because we are going to we are opening ourselves in very deep ways together. I mean, it's one of the things when I think about the years that I spent in community, and we would need a much longer call than this to go into the ins and outs of and the complexities of community, but for sure there were aspects of communal life. I mean, there were aspects that were miraculous and magnificent and wonderful, and there were aspects which were painful and damaging and traumatizing. And you come into a situation like that, into a spiritual community, and you give yourself to it, and you open up wholeheartedly. And the fact is, that you don't really know how to do this, and neither does anyone around you know how to do it. And yet one of the most, so in retrospect, one of the most beautiful things in my memory of being part of a very committed community of seekers is how willing we all were to just open up together and throw ourselves in to a process that, knowing that none of us really knew how to do it, and also knowing that we were all imperfect beings. None of us were perfect. None of us were beyond reproach, and yet we engaged completely, energetically, wholeheartedly, sometimes, for the magnificently better and sometimes for the much worse. And yet that spirit of being so compelled to find one's way to a higher understanding, a higher vision, that was so compelling to everyone involved that we were willing to take the risk of that kind of full-on, wholehearted engagement. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about community. And so, yes, I guess I would say that given the nature of being human and the culture that we live in and the imperfections that we all carry, it's hard to imagine that kind of wholehearted spiritual engagement would somehow manage to be free of trauma.
Yeah, impossible, probably. One of the things that also really caught my attention as I read that particular chapter was that they were talking about beloved community in action and how it invokes and relies upon the mystery when it comes together to address trauma that has arisen in the community. It doesn't rely on outer authority. It doesn't rely on somebody else's rules. It invokes, first of all, there's an invocation, and then reliance upon the mystery or the beloved or God or whatever, called by many names. So it's quite powerful that this happens in a liminal space, an in-between space, probably between one platform in our lives and the next platform in our lives. And my guess is that some of us are in that experience right now. And we think that the things that have happened in our world, I mean, I've talked to people who were part of the beloved community of Unity of Tustin, who have had their businesses just put on total hold and feel, will it survive? The questions, their lives put on. People in the community who have had family members that are in the hospital with COVID-19, and Melanie, who is our virtual assistant, who we asked our community to be in prayers for, how important it is. So let's just take a moment right now, Jeff, just right in this moment, and simply go into that space, that experience of the presence. And I'm going to say a few words and then invite you to say a few words. And I simply say, come, Holy Spirit. Come, O beloved one. Fill us with your presence. Fill us with your power. Reveal to us the energy that you are offering in our lives right in this now moment to take us higher and deeper and into the vastness that we cannot yet understand. Reveal to us the healing that is always already present, the light that shines in the dark. Show us the way. And add anything, Jeff, you would like to say or speak.
Well, I feel compelled to say that I know many people are hurt and hurting now, and that in many ways this looks like a very challenging and grim time. And there's a temptation always to generate stories about how bad it is. But I want to simply offer that there is an inherent goodness to being alive. And you may not feel it right now, but if you embrace the totality of what it means to be human, and right now it means going through some challenging times, the goodness will reveal itself in the end.
It will reveal itself. And so what we're dealing with is the dynamic between the invisible and the visible, both simultaneously present in this now moment, now with a capital N, that is about past, present, and future as one. We are, in fact, for me, in the language I like to use, dancing on the edge of what might emerge if we say yes. And it's not about us, except it's an invitation to be an instrument of a greater power. And when that power shows the miracles that are possible, the unfolding greater consciousness that's possible, we can't take credit for arranging any of it. What we do is say yes to it. So one of the things, I listened to an amazing call with Charles Eisenstein recently that Terry Patton did. And Charles Eisenstein talked about the power of letting stories be heard. So let's go back to your story. You decide to leave your beloved community after all of these years. And so do you want to pick up from there?
Sure. Well, after 20 years, I decided to leave / the community disbanded. I mean, technically I left just before it disbanded, but it was all part of one event. And it feels, that was now about 8 years ago, and it wasn't a graceful ending, but these endings usually aren't graceful. But it felt, and it still feels like it was a necessary ending, that the community, which had been in operation for about 27 years, of which I had been there for 20, it had come to a place where it wasn't sustainable anymore. It needed to move on. And to be honest, I think the individuals involved needed more space to grow. The container of the community became a limit on what was possible for people in terms of their growth. I think that happens in community. I think community is a space for people's growth, and there comes a point, at least for many people, where that container is now too small, and it's time to move on. And the community that I was in, moving on wasn't really part of our mindset, and so, as it turned out, the container itself had to break apart, and that liberated everyone. Unfortunately, it did so in ways that, also created a lot of damage and harm along the way. And, I know you just read this piece that Richard Rohr said that almost made it sound like trauma in a community is inevitable. I guess I wouldn't want to claim that. I'd like to think it's possibly not inevitable, even though the evidence certainly stacks up in that direction. But I think, what I'm feeling right now, and I'm thinking about this 20-something-year-old person you said was listening, trying to figure out what graduate degree she was going to pursue. And, we alluded to people right now who are suffering for various reasons. And I think the thing that gets the foundational challenge, I think, under all circumstances, is always the same, which is we're tempted to think we know. And when times are challenging, we think we know that this is terrible and it's going to get worse. When things are good, we're tempted to know that this is going to continue or it's going to get better. I think at least for myself, I make as much effort as possible to not know, to not be so sure about whether, for instance, trauma is necessary in community or not. Or, I don't really know whether it is or not. And just generally, if there's one thing that my life has conveyed to me, unquestionably, it's that I don't really know what's going on. This event that we call human life is much bigger than I can understand. And so many things have already happened and continue to happen that feel sourced, as you were saying, from some invisible place that I'm not privy to. And I think, I've had the privilege, you spoke about my story. My story essentially is the story of having had the privilege and the opportunity to experience so many energetic and spiritual awakenings over a long time of dedicated practice, and that continued to this day. And, all I can really feel is grateful that that's the life that I lived. And although it was often very difficult and very traumatic, the end result is I've been opened to the fact of the mystery, which basically boils down to the fact that I don't know, in ways that I would never want to go back and do anything differently and risk losing that sense of how big life is. And so I'm always trying to be careful in the sense that I recognize that coming to fixed conclusions about the way things are is a natural part of how our minds work, and things are always bigger than our fixed conclusions would lead us to believe. So yeah, I think in terms of my story, that's what it's brought to me is a very deep understanding that I don't really know how this all works. And yet, I have ample evidence that there is something that you could call an inherent goodness inherent in life. It's not always good to me in every circumstance, but in a bigger picture, it's life is pro-life in every way. And so even at times when it may feel personally harsh, if I give it time, I'm always aware that something good is happening here.
No, I love what you're saying, and what I'm aware of is I'd love to have you talk a little bit more about the after the exit, after that decision, which was difficult because you had met Amy, you had been married, you had recreated within that community. You were director of education, and weren't you editor also of Enlighten Next or something like that?
Director of education, and I was my teacher's personal assistant.
Okay.
I did do some writing for the magazine, but I was not an editor.
But you traveled around the world, meeting an amazing group of souls, and there was an amazing group of souls there in the community that would continue to be part of your life, especially Amy, who's created her own incredible work there in Philadelphia. But you and I reconnected again, interestingly, on a telesummit that was being produced by Britt Thomas. And I do have this date, 2012. It was called Raising Consciousness Now Summit, and it was in October of 2012. And there was one person on that call that immediately was my attracting. There's always an attracting element. And there was one person on that call that was my attracting element, and it was you. And when I saw that you were going to be on that summit, I signed up for it. And you were doing a co-teaching on a presentation with Patricia Albera. I'd never heard of her, didn't know about her, but I knew about you, and I trusted the consciousness that I knew in you, that I'd experienced in you, that light that was so powerful. And as a result, I also reconnected with Britt Thomas that I had met in 2004 at an Integral conference, and been in one of his workshops. And so it's amazing how Spirit keeps connecting people at different moments in time. So pick up your story just a bit from there about what the last 8 years have been for you.
Well, they've been an interesting time. Of course, the community came to an end, and I wasn't really sure what I was going to do. And as you said, I had gotten married a second time. My wife, Amy, and I were both part of the community, and we're still together, living in Philadelphia. And as you said, she teaches meditation in high schools here. And I had already started teaching with Patricia Albert and the Evolutionary Collective sort of before the community had disbanded. And so it naturally made sense to continue to do that. And then after a couple of years, I actually published a couple of books, and then wrote a couple of books. One called Radical Inclusivity, one called Soul of a New Self, which happened because I was doing a retreat with friends. They had all previously been part of the community. We decided to do a kind of self-led retreat together. And part of that retreat was journaling. And so I started journaling, and as I started journaling during this week-long retreat that we were doing, I decided that I wanted to write down everything that I'd learned from all those years in community. And I just kept writing and writing, and then the retreat ended, and I kept writing and writing and writing, and eventually, the material that became 2 books popped out of that writing. And by then, it was clear that in some form or another, I was compelled to keep sharing the gifts that I'd been blessed with. And so I eventually started to teach on my own and leading meditation retreats and largely teaching meditation and also mystical philosophy. And I kept writing more books because I found that was a medium that I loved. And, if we move right up to the present day, I feel deeply, deeply blessed by the fact that I seem to have perspectives and insights to share that many people find valuable, and I have been able to create a life centered around sharing those spiritual perspectives and insights that people find valuable, and it really. It would be difficult for me to describe how grateful I feel and how wonderful it is to be sharing, to have your life revolve around the sharing of that which you love the most. I mean, that's the wish that I wish for everyone. It's what the people who come to work with me, what I really hope for them is that what they love the most can become more and more the center of their life.
I've seen you do that with Dorothy Walters, and I am just so grateful. I mean, it just touches my heart so deeply to know that you published her last book and acknowledge her as a person who's helped you understand part of your own path. And oh my goodness, that was by reconnecting with you this time. So many times of reconnecting with you, Jeff.
Yes, I've actually published. Let's see, I think the last 3 of Dorothy's books, and according to her, she's a magnificent woman. She's busy writing a new one, so she's still got more to say.
Beautiful. So I don't want to lose track of the fact that I want you to talk a little bit about the meditation experience that you are beginning on Saturday. It's an online event primarily, I think, and talk a little bit about that and tell people where they can get more information about that.
Sure. I mean, it's pretty simple. It starts on Saturday, and it's a 30-day program, which revolves around 1 hour each day live with me. And during that time, I want to take people through a discovery process in meditation. And what I'm going to ask people to do is use this 30 days as essentially a retreat, but a retreat in the midst of life. We're doing an hour a day together, and people can do it live if that works for them. And for some people, it won't work to do it live, and they'll listen to it as a recording later. But I think with just that much instruction every day and a few guidelines in terms of how to maintain a kind of open, focused attitude through the rest of your life for 30 days. So for an hour a day, you're really getting focused in practice, and then outside of that time, although I know some people will choose to do more practice than that, which would be great, but outside of the formal practice and the formal discussion that we're having around practice, I really want to encourage people and make some suggestions as to how to stay open and perceptive, so that, because when we're open and perceptive, the mystery of life will present itself. You can see it at any moment, and if you're looking in the, if we're not particularly open and receptive, then we will tend to go through life through our habitual patterns and our habits of perception and see things the way we've always seen them. But if we have just that little bit of space, which creates a little liberation in our receptivity, we will start to see things differently than we normally see them. And I think that'll be a huge part of the benefit is that our life will start showing up differently. And then one last thing I would say, which relates to some of what you had said earlier about the liminal space in this particular program, I see meditation as essentially having two stages or two elements, not necessarily sequentially, but one is the complete relaxed letting go, which is how one attains what I would want to call spiritual freedom. It means you're no longer reactively engaged with anything. You've just come to complete rest. The position which is often described as the witness, where you're aware of everything, but you're not involved with any of it. You are a free-floating source of awareness. But I don't see that as being the only goal of meditation, because I think from there, when we've liberated ourselves that profoundly from engagement with the world, we will start to feel deeper stirrings. The deeper parts of our soul and our spirit will start to be moved by possibilities that we just wouldn't see if we were reactively engaged with our sort of normal minds. And so there's another part of the meditative process which has to do with allowing yourself to be moved into new perceptions and new ways of seeing. It involves entering into what you were referring to before as the liminal space or the imaginal realm, and engaging in a practice which I like to call creative illumination, where you are not just passively witnessing, but you are in some very profound and deeply surrendered co-creative way participating in the emergence of new possibilities in your own experience. And so that dimension, that second dimension, is what I intend for us to be more focused on in this 30 days. Over the last few years, I've tended to focus on the spiritual freedom, but this program will be different in that I think this more imaginal, liminal space of meditation is where I'm going to be encouraging people to give their attention.
Beautiful. And tell people how they can get more information about it, the link.
Sure. It's very easy. They can just go to my website, which is jeffcarreira.com, so www.jeffcarreira.com.
And spell your last name for them.
Sure. It's Carreira.
You know, I think you have done such a beautiful job of presenting this, and I loved just looking at the pages of it, of the offer, and the way you laid it out. It was just beautifully done, and so thank you so much, Jeff. And 30 days, this is such a profoundly important time in this time of the pandemic, time of the darkness and void, with spirit hovering over the face of the waters. And so thank you. And also thank you for being willing to share so much of your own story. I am profoundly committed to creating spaces where people can pay attention to their own stories as a sacred love story. I found it very, very interesting as I was looking at you know, all of the kind of things I wanted to think about before the call with you, that one of the things that I came across in looking at, listening to different people talking about this time of the void, this time of the pandemic, this time of the darkness, Charles Eisenstein saying how much power there was in letting stories be heard and honoring, recognizing and honoring all that is, and being curious rather than judging, being curious and wondering and asking why. You know, why did you do that? And behind that question is always a story. And one of the things he says is that before we are competent to gather solutions, we need to gather information. And in order to do that, we have to hear the stories. And the other requirement is seeing the person as a divine being and entering that spaciousness with them, because that is when the miracle happens and when the amazing energy of full creative force and power begins to flow. And I love the fact that people are being willing to make these kinds of commitments in this time to being in this kind of space. And another person I heard talking about the importance of stories was another person that Terry Patton interviewed. Her name is Spring Washam, and she's a meditation teacher, but she's also a person committed to bringing mindfulness-based healing practices to diverse communities. She's doing it in Oakland, California, for example, at the East Bay Meditation Center. And she talks about soul wounds and how gatherings are so important, where people can tell their stories, where they can examine what their imprints were, what the settings of their lives were, but how important it is to make it safe. It's not about shame or blame. It's being willing to let the stories reveal the conditioning and the acting that came out of that conditioning, or the programs that were imprinted in us, perhaps by our ancestors, perhaps in other generations, and letting that curiosity lead us into being lead us into being courageous, with the willingness to enter that courage as from our heart's Carreira, and go higher and deeper and be guided. One of the interesting things for me is that I'm no longer finding myself as attracted to being identified as minister or even spiritual teacher. The word that is beginning to forefront in my own awareness is the word guide, to guide people, like Lewis and Clark guiding people through the unexamined territory, unmapped territory of the Louisiana Purchase, and beginning to map it in new ways. And it becomes our mission, it becomes our purpose, and we don't even know what the map is going to look like necessarily. And it will look at differently in different stages of our life. It'll look differently at different times of our perceptions of what purpose looks like. So for my beloved friend in her 20s wondering what's next relative to graduate education, she may go through lots of shifts as it continues to unfold, as you have talked about today. My book is all about that. So I know, Jeff, you said that you inquired whether the call was an hour and a half, and I wanted to ask you if you're open to our opening the line to some questions.
Sure.
Or if you're going to, okay, fabulous. So, Fabian, do you want to come on and let people know how they can raise their hands?
I will, and thank you for this beautiful and profound conversation, and definitely finding a lot of value and depth in it, so thank you so much. So if you are dialing on the phone with us and would like to raise your hand, you can press star 2 on your keypad, and that will let us know that you would like to speak with Marj and Jeff. If you are on the web call, you can also raise your hand. You see the button there, and you can talk live as well. And otherwise, if you are on the broadcast and also on the web, if you prefer to write a message, you can write a message and submit it, press submit, then I will receive it and I'll pass it on to Marj. So these are the ways that you can reach us live. Oh, and there is already a line up, a hand up. So I'm going to unmute that person.
And it's a 714 number?
I think that might be me. Can you hear me?
Hey, and I recognize the voice, Bruce.
Well, good morning, Marj. Good morning, Jeff. Thank you so much. I'm sitting here lit up like a Roman candle. Charles Fillmore used to say, sizzling with zeal. And I wanted to just mention Marj. Jeff, I was part of that group back to Unity Village. I think that was back in 2005.
You were.
And there was a Michael Ward, obviously yourself, Helen went, and I think maybe Marty and Harvey, but it was a small group. And I remember the day Jeff showed up, and we were in that building where the chapel is, and I heard a beating on the door. The double glass doors were locked, and I remember feeling kind of annoyed by it. And I don't know what was going on, but I remember opening the door, and it was Jeff. And I didn't know Jeff from Adam at the time. And I don't know why I want to remind you of this, but I think I just blew you off. But if I'm recalling, but I remember very vividly the talk you gave, Jeff. And I remember Andrew was unable to make the first day for whatever reason. And I remember when Andrew did show up, I think you presented something, a model that Andrew was working on. I think you referred to it as bottom up or something. And I was absolutely thrilled by that. And then Andrew came the next day, and he carried on. And I had the thought that, Andrew's great, but it almost seemed anticlimactic to me because I thought, man, I'd just soon be listening to Jeff up here. And so I just really want to thank you for your really gift to articulate this stuff, because I can relate to so much of it. I had a pretty traumatic early years, and over the course of my life, I have sometimes felt cursed by the impact that it's had on me, and then when I'm in the silence or connected with spirit, I feel it's my greatest blessing. So I don't want to take too much time for the other callers, but I just wanted to mention that, and it's so good to be back in the field of Marj and you, Jeff. So thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Bruce. And I don't know if it was someone did mention, at that time in Unity Village, someone did mention to me that how much they appreciated my, what I was sharing on that first day, and even, were saying that they would have been happy to listen to me the entire weekend. And I don't know if it was Absolutely. You or not, but I certainly I appreciate the sentiment. So thank you so much, Bruce.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Marj.
Well, I have the feeling of just the awareness of awe in what was flowing in you and through you and as you, Jeff. It was exquisite. It was extraordinary, and yet there was absolutely no awareness that was visible to me of a personal ego self. You were just there, being a vessel, and so thank you. I mean, it was such an amazing day for me, and really, really loved that. So, Bruce, anything else?
Yeah, there is, but I lost my train of thought here. But I just remember it vividly, and I think of it from time to time, and I've kind of drifted off. I've been on my path, which includes another pretty profound dip into the shadow and the darkness, and I'm kind of coming through that now. And so I feel blessed to just be on this call to kind of be re-inspired, reconnected to, because it feels like a home I had grown used to with Marj. I mean, those days back at Unity, I mean, for a number of years there, I refer to them as Camelot. I mean, the parade of master teachers that came through there is mind-boggling. I mean, of course, there was Andrew, Ram Das, Don Beck, Andrew Harvey, and I was signed up for every one of those intensives, and I was in the choir and Conscious Covenant. I mean, I practically lived down there I was helping out with the gardens for a number of years, and all things must pass, but feel so blessed and grateful that I was able to be part of that period. And so I would add that.
So one of the things that has been continuing to come to me, Jeff, and I'd love your thoughts on this, is that what I keep seeing a vision of is another level of the collective emerging. And it's not a collective that is run by one person that's a charismatic leader. And it's a collective that is run by this higher power. And it holds. And actually, Richard Rohr pointed out very explicitly that it wasn't an absolute that people would go, or communities would go into trauma, that was not a requirement, but it just seems that it may be one of the likely things that can happen. And certainly, I mean, I could have never imagined that Unity of Tustin would have gone into that. And I mean, it was like a golden experience for me. And then that it could experience these kinds of levels of trauma, I couldn't even have imagined it. But, you know, what feels to me, it's not clear yet, but it's a glimpse that there is some kind of collective modality of the future, that it is, and Ontario Fallon's work, she identified different numbers for levels, and they have some relationship to dimensions of vibration, I think. She's never said that, but I'm wondering about that. And in the very rare stages in the collective, that where action is involved and the kinds of things that are part of that, it comes from a collective. And Don Beck had a glimpse of this when he talked about that leadership rotates and evolves in between people who have gifts of genius in different areas. But and one of the things that I found very interesting that Thomas Hubel said was that there is, in that kind of modality, there's a moment of group coherence where everyone participating becomes totally coherent with one person's story, and that everyone carries within them these codes of collective wholeness. And I mean, when I saw or heard the word codes and wrote it down, and as I was jotting down some notes and listening to Thomas Hubel, I immediately thought, oh my God, that's the title of my book, Your Soul's Invisible Codes, that everyone carries codes of this collective invisible within them, and that the collective presence actually upgrades what an individual can do because they are in the experience of that collective. Mm. And I would love, I mean, this is my passionate yearning, I would love to be a part of that kind of collective. And the next level of the future, you know, what are we going into? What are the possibilities now that we don't even know are possible? And I thought about my grandmother, had no idea. She went to some of the lectures given by Susan B. Anthony on women's right to vote. My grandmother only traveled on an airplane very late in her life, and it wasn't a jet. My grandmother never knew anything about technology and never had access to any of it. What are the possibilities that we don't even know are possible now? And the alpha and the omega, how do we bridge the gap? Through our heart, which seems to be this center, and how do we actually bring heaven to earth? So I'd love to hear if you have any final thoughts, Jeff about what that could be. We only have maybe 10 minutes left in our 90 minutes, but
I mean, for me, I have plenty of things to say about that, in the sense that I've been interested in pursuing and in the center of spiritual community, for almost 3 decades now, and quite involved in the formation of a few of those, and peripherally involved in others. And I guess I'm interested in the interaction, the communal interaction between self-actualizing individuals, and I'm interested in the kind of community that can organically develop when we're not trying to make it develop. I'm interested in community that's not being shaped by any ideas about community, but just is organically developing. So one of the things that I do is I have an online membership community. And the way that I look at that is I've tried to create structures, as I've said earlier, I was an engineer, so I tend to think structurally. I have created structures that that facilitate and encourage members to engage with each other virtually, including a virtual classroom that members use to teach classes to the community. And so, I really see it as a kind of co-learning, co-evolutionary space. And at this point, I certainly do play a key role, a central role in the community. And that often seems to be a necessary role. Sometimes I think of it as the role of convening. The ability to convene, the ability to bring people together in shared spaces, whether they be virtual or physical, is a gift, and it's a power. It's something that for instance, I seem to have, and I don't know that it's a personal attribute. It's the life that I lived has gifted me with this ability to convene, which is wonderful because it means I can create a space like a membership, a virtual membership, and people will come and engage. But once they're there, I see it as a garden, so the spaces and the structures that I create, I try to make them nutrient rich. So of course I like to share my insights and perspectives with all the members that are interested in those, and I have other people, other individuals who have extraordinary. Dorothy Walters, you mentioned already, is one who shares regularly with the community, and I feel like those individuals are helping to add nutrients to the soil of relationship. And then, of course, as I said, many of the members teach courses of all different types, and or offer workshops, etc. And that all becomes part of the nutrition. There's a shared blog space that people can use, and there are ongoing events that different members have organized, study groups and writing groups, etc. I'm beginning to see more people writing books and having manuscripts, and some of those I hope to be able to publish. And I just feel like I can feel this gathering of people starting to have a life of its own. The the structures for engagement are becoming more and more utilized, more and more full, and you start to feel like there's a self-generating energy. There's a real co-learning, co-evolving momentum that's occurring, and it, it feels like a collective that is essentially being born in the same way that an organism gets born, becomes born, and I'm very curious about what will emerge out of that. And my ideal is I realized that I was have been key in setting it up and have played a central role, and I hope and believe and see that while I'm sure there will always be a role for me to play in this community, that role will become less and less central as the community itself, starts to become more self-regulating and autonomous. So that's what I'm currently very interested in. I work with Nora Bateson, who's the daughter of Gregory Bateson, and Nora is also contributes her wisdom to our forums, and her profound grasp of systems theory, what she calls somaticity, and the way that co-learning occurs and how to create structures has really been something I've learned a great deal from, and I continue to use as a model for creating the structures of my online offering. So there's just a little bit of a piece of that conversation around community and what's possible. I guess the main thing that I would want to emphasize is I think what's most important is creating the structures that allow mutual engagement to occur, and then allowing that engagement to be free enough to change itself, to grow without being controlled in how it will grow, and then creating as nutrient-rich a soil as possible to just like a garden. You make the soil as rich as you possibly can, and then you plant seeds, and then you water the seeds, and then you watch them grow. And in the same way, I think a community can grow in the same way in a garden, a soil that is prepared in consciousness for it.
That sounds so beautiful. I had one magical experience of this that I will never forget, and that was about a year and a half ago, in February of last year. I did co-taught an experience with Terry O'Fallon, who is the founder of Stages International, with her brother Kim Barta, and the three of us did a week-long event. And it started on a Sunday afternoon, and people registered for the Love as Never Before, which was basically about love stages, the stages of love in our lives. And then it ended that after the first 4 days and transitioned into a meta-aware group, which is what you're referring to as a self-actualizing group, because these are people who had scored in these very rare stages on her inventory, and they'd never met each other. And it was fascinating. She said, I want to give them a chance to meet each other. And so she opened 2 days at the end to simply people signing up for the experience. And none of us knew who the other people would be. And when we got there, some of them were well known and some of them were not. Some of them were No one knew who they were, and they were just people who had the experience of scoring in this rare level. And for those 2 days, she said, I'm not going to be the teacher, and you have to figure out how you're going to have it unfold. And it all emerged from the collective consciousness of the group. And I can tell you sometime how that happened. But there were no ego wars going on. There was no one trying to grandstand or take control. There were people offering their gifts, and for anyone who wanted to show up to participate. And 100 people registered for that week-long experience. And they came from 8 different countries and 7 different states. And it was completely, the last 2 days, completely unplanned. The first 5 days were planned with instruction about how love shows up differently at different stages. But those last 2 days, I'd never seen any or participated in anything like it. I consider myself a really talented and gifted facilitator, but I was not facilitating anything except one offering that I put out as potential, and some people came to. And it was totally, totally magical, totally co-creative. I wondered whether it would work when she told me her plan, which was no plan. And I was absolutely stunningly surprised and delighted to see what emerged. So I know it's possible now. And we are out of time, so I just want to thank you again so much, Jeff, for being with us. And we're going to end our call with listening to Liebestrom, which I used to play on the harp when I was 15 years old. And Liebestrom is something that always emerges as a song of love, a dream of love in my own life. And so let's go into that as we hold in deep gratitude this incredible time with you, Jeff, and the incredible essence of what you've brought into this story gathering moment.